I wanted to say first and foremost, before we start anything, our condolences to the family of Luyen Phan Nguyen, who was tragically murdered on August 17th, 1992. The racially charged incident that led to the violent, horrific death of Luyen Phan Nguyen, a University of Miami pre-med student in 1992, speaks precisely to the anti-Asian sentiment that is shared by a particular segment of our society. And with this story, it took place before the age of social media or the internet, by and large. But again, you see it on your screen. Coral Springs, Florida. Nguyen was chased down like a wounded deer by 7 drunken college-age men. They shouted ignorant expletives and then proceeded to stomp Nguyen to death. One thing to keep in mind is that at this party where this terrible, horrendous, horrific event transpired, there were many individuals, many men that were there that apparently got involved in this beatdown, if you will. But officially, only 7 individuals were charged, 5 were convicted, and to date, only 1 individual is currently locked up, while the others are free. Here's the story. It was a humid late summer Saturday evening in South Florida in 1992. A few days before Hurricane Andrew barreled through, a group of teens gathered around a keg in a Coral Springs apartment. They played the drinking game, quarters, and tried to hook up with the opposite sex. There were about 30 kids in Unit 203 of the Springside apartment that night. The group comprised of honor students and gangbanger wannabes, metalheads and hicks, stoners, and boozers. Grunge was at its peak, so there were a few people in flannel shirts despite the muggy weather. Kids spilled onto the second-story balcony. A bottle of Jim Beam was passed around. Shortly after 11 p.m., 19-year-old Luyen Nguyen, a pre-med student at the University of Miami, showed up with 2 friends, Jeff Sente and Ryan Guerra. The trio hardly knew anyone at the apartment. They tried to mingle, but instead got into a heated discussion with other partygoers about whether it was better to be in the Army or the Marines. Feeling unwelcome, Luyen, Jeff, and Ryan left. On their way out, Jeff thought he heard someone say, quote-unquote, chink, and, quote-unquote, sayonara. The 3 friends stopped outside the apartment. Luyen was Vietnamese-American. He'd immigrated to the U.S. with his family when he was 6. Had he heard the insults? Jeff asked. No, Luyen said, but learning of them, the slightly built youth was full of bravado and wanted to confront the taunters. So he did, and a pack of young men punched and kicked him until he was unconscious. Luyen escaped from the crowd only to be chased down and pummeled again. One blow landed behind his right ear at the base of his skull, fracturing his second cervical vertebra and lacerating the vertebral artery. This single blow to the neck killed him almost instantly. The attack grabbed national headlines for its brutality, and also for the contrast it presented with the picturesque town where it took place. Coral Springs was seemingly successful, a successful experiment, if you will, a suburban utopia carved out of marshland in 1964 and marketed as the perfect place to raise a family. Strict aesthetic codes, grass must be 8 inches or less, compelled tidiness. All the buildings were painted pastel tones and the streets were supposed to be quiet and safe. More often than not, parents were affluent, their children college-bound. Coral Springs was a privileged, sanitized, middle-class milieu. But apparently, it was also a place where spoiled teens sometimes drifted in search of alcohol, drugs, and mischief. With the world over its shoulder, Coral Springs police gathered statements from teen witnesses who waffled when one suspected individual stood trial. First alone, Court TV broadcasts his live trial. Ultimately, 5 young men who were at the Springside apartments that night would be found guilty of second-degree murder for their roles in the beating. Bradley Mills went to trial first. He was sentenced to 50 years for the beating death of Luyen Nguyen, though he still swears he never touched him. Brad spent his first few years inside lifting weights and playing the tough guy, he said. But now his 5'8" frame has some extra padding, and he's more focused on developing vocational skills such as plumbing. His left thigh droops, a souvenir from the time he was shot in the face. The bullet nearly snuffed out Brad's young life. He was 15, the victim of a neighbor playing with a loaded gun. He was hospitalized for 5 weeks, and when he got out, he had a speech impediment, a bad one, owing to the paralysis of parts of his esophagus and tongue. He said that he talked like Marlon Brando in Godfather, and that it'd give him a bad complex, so he just stayed quiet. He also was treated for PTSD, though he likely received PTSD from another incident when he was hit by a car while riding his bike at the age of 12. In any case, Brad says he's not sure who hit Luyen that night. After the first slap, it was like WrestleMania, he said. Fists flew, but you couldn't tell who was punching. It went by so fast, he said, saying that the whole incident took as long as 2 minutes. And if that was the case, he'd be surprised. As he was going to the party that night, Brad came upon Luyen and Jeff and Ryan outside the apartment. The 3 were agitated, talking loudly. Brad asked them to keep their voices down so they didn't bug the neighbors. He asked that the problem wasn't a big deal, and what was the problem? Racial slurs, they said. Brad asked them what they wanted him to do about it. Jeff, Brad suggested he call out the name callers to sort things out. They were up on the balcony, and Brad summoned them. Next, a bunch of the kids from the party spilled onto the black asphalt parking lot and milled around the 3 friends. Brad doesn't remember exactly what Luyen said that riled up the party, but he does remember that Luyen was confrontational. Others said Luyen told them they were a bunch of drunks who would end up cutting his lawn. Luyen and his friends were outnumbered and outmuscled. Brad said he told Jeff, who he had known because their mothers were friends, to get out of there. Then someone slapped Luyen. It was a signal, and guys pounced on him. The medical examiner testified at Brad's trial. He showed the jury photos of Luyen's bruised corpse. He spent 30 minutes detailing the insults to the body of the 5'6", 139-pound pre-med student. Each blow could have contributed to a stunning effect. He said, so when the final blow came, Luyen was disoriented. His reflexes were gone. The cause of death, he said, was a subarachnoid hemorrhage due to the lacerated vertebral artery, that is. In other words, someone whacked Luyen so hard at the base of his skull that they split his artery, killing him. It was an extremely rare injury, he said. Jeff testified. He told the jury he saw Brad punch Luyen at the start of the brawl. Using another man as a stand-in for Luyen, Jeff faked a jab twice to demonstrate, but it was almost just the opposite of what Jeff initially told the police. Asked by police if Brad hit Luyen, Jeff said, quote, I don't think so. Jeff told police that he'd met Brad before the night and said that Brad was, quote unquote, the one that was trying to keep anything from happening. He knew me and, I guess he liked me or whatever. And he was telling me, you know, something's gonna happen if you don't take your friends and go. A few weeks later, Jeff told the jury that he'd never met Brad before that night. In subsequent trials, attorneys for 3 of the other accused would get their clients' statements to police suppressed. The judge would rule that Detective Milford improperly used threats and promises to try to get confessions from the other teams. By the time the last set of defendants were on trial, Milford had been demoted for allegedly punching a teenager's head against a wall after the youth insulted him. After Brad's trial, 4 men were prosecuted together in 1994. William Madelone, who had given a graphic confession to police, was sentenced to life. Terry Jameson, who admitted to only punching Luyen, got 22 years. Chris Madelone, who pleaded guilty, got 16 years. And Chris Anderson, whose slap initiated the fight, got 13 years. The last 2 defendants went before the judge in 1995. They were Derek Kuzma. But the thing is, Kuzma's confession, in which he told police that he kicked Luyen in the head 4 times, wasn't enough to convict him, and he was acquitted by the jury. A few months later, Derek was charged with splitting the head of another teenager with a beer mug. So, cycle of violence. Michael Barychko, that's Barychko, the last defendant, said he caved under police pressure, that is, and admitted to kicking Luyen when he actually had only nudged the youth. Dave Michelson kicked her son in the head as he lay helpless on the ground. Michael had told the police the same thing years earlier, but Dave was never charged. Michael was convicted of aggravated battery and sentenced to 18 months in prison. To this day, Michael still insists that he witnessed the killing blow. I saw a kid lying on the grass and people running from the body. I tapped him on the back to see if he was moving. I said, "Hello, are you okay? Hello?" I was standing over him when Dave Michelson kicked him in the head. Witnesses pegged the number of attackers at perhaps a dozen. Michael Barychko, to the police investigators, was clumsy, and it was a witch hunt. And the teens vouched for their friends and accused others that they didn't like. Justice was not done, he said. Brad Mills agreed. This is Coral Springs. Big money, he said. Police had to make a move. I don't believe they cared one bit about getting the right people. What happened to Luyen is terrible. For real, it is, Brad continued. If I could change any of that, I would.